everybody, it's Stories Live. I'm Amy Armstrong, and this is our May show. It's Wednesday, May 19th, 2021. So, yay, a little over a year after lockdown. So, we're still here. Very exciting stuff. And so tonight, we have a relatively small group, but still pretty good group. We've got Gwynne Stanker, who is actually featured in the Pikes Peak Writers Anthology, which is our first ever anthology with the theme Fresh Starts. We're going to have right after her, I just want to make sure I get the order right, even though I came up with it myself. So we'll have Gwynne, then we'll have Tom Broderick, who also goes by Thomas Kichi. He's been on the show many times before, and he has some translations out. He had a story published in Artful Dodge. He, does like a little bit of everything. We have Sue Fine, who I believe also has a story in the anthology under a different name because she's sneaky like that, and I don't remember it off the top of my head. And then at the very end, we will have Julia Allen, who I'm sure will have something dark and sexy to read. So I'm excited. This is a good group. So I am going to go ahead and bring Gwynne up here.
Hello, hello.
Hello. So what are you reading tonight?
I'm going to read not from the anthology, but I'm super excited to be in the Fresh Starts anthology with a lot of really fabulous other authors there. My story in the anthology is White Fox and the Water Woman. Nice. But tonight I'm going to read something that's a work in progress. And it's called Night of the Cheetah.
Sounds good. I'll let you take it away.
All right. She heard chirping. Night birds, she told him. Then she heard a growl. No, little one, he said. Those are cheetahs calling to one another in the tall grass. But don't be afraid. The plane starts this little fire. See? I feed it. He gave it a piece of oily rag. The trash was all around them, twisted metal and upended seats, the wreckage of the crashed plane. The cries of passengers, the terrible screams from people, the ones she could not see, frightened her. Do not cry. He could only move one arm, but he held her eyes with his. My people say the souls of those the cheetahs eat go into the cheetahs and are happy. He held out a doll. It was black, like his skin. Her papa had showed her a black cutting stone, obsidian, he had said. The cutting stone was old, older than she was, older than anyone. The stone belonged to the Africans, not the white ones who came later, but the first ones, the dark ones. Like this man. In his outstretched palm, the doll looked small, only inches long. Uncertain, the girl looked up at him. This doll needs a friend, he said, encouraging her with his eyes. She looked at the doll and then took it into her hand. The man sighed. In her palm, the doll looked bigger, but she could almost hide it if she curled her fingers around its round belly. The doll's smooth head poked from under her thumb. Its white shell eyes stared past her ears. He said in a soft voice, "I was going to give this to my daughter, but she has gone on ahead of me. I can hear her calling, 'Baba, a Baba,'" he said in a small voice. She guessed that those words meant Papa, but her ears were full of the cries of the hurt ones, the ones the cheetahs found. The man took a ragged breath. "Soon I must go." The stone doll grew heavy in her hand. She looked into the man's eyes and shivered. Like the doll, he seemed to be staring at some faraway place. Then his eyes found hers again. He smiled, his teeth white in the firelight. "Your doll's name is Chiambikizo. Hope." His eyes closed. He went still like the doll. She kept his fire burning until morning. The trill of birdsong pierced the dawn stillness. Surprised, the girl opened her eyes. From where she lay on the ground, she watched as, just a few feet from her face, a small yellow-winged bird hopped about, pecking for tidbits among the trash. The bird and its song were a surprise. She had expected vultures. Even a 9-year-old girl knew that vultures do not sing. She stayed still and watched the yellow-winged bird as it hopped about its birdie business. Once it had hopped far enough away that she would not frighten it, she sat up and scanned the sky. Just as she had expected, the vultures were already present, their huge, feathery wings tracing endless circles in the sky. She watched as the dark birds dropped down in ever-narrowing circles until at last they made landfall in great awkward hops, clawed feet outstretched, naked heads seeking, curved beaks ready to rip and tear. For a moment, one of the birds, white head sunk beneath dark shoulders, turned and fixed a red eye on her. "Hello, we are Death. Come to make your acquaintance. All things come to us in the end, girl. Even you, even you." It turned its head away. She had failed muster as food. Perhaps later. Understanding that the dead would make no complaint, the girl watched frozen, unable to look away, as, skinned heads glistening red in the sunlight, the vultures pulled, jerked, and swallowed. She shuddered. She knew why the creatures did not approach her, just as she knew why they did not sing. An old Indian ayah had once told her, "The dark birds are summoned, child, not by the living, but by the newly dead, who do not feel, nor do they hear." The feeding frenzy continued until, startled by the roar of big trucks arriving on the far side of the plain, the hungry vultures abandoned their feast and with one rise and fall of their powerful wings soared into the air. They did not fly away. As if tethered to the site by the stink of death, they once again began their endless circling. The girl looked away, searching for the little yellow-winged bird, which hopped back toward her as if it had heard her call, and stayed with her for a moment longer. Then, alarmed by the noise of truck engines and men's shouts, the tiny creature, which had been unfazed by the arrival of the vultures, darted into the sky, became a yellow dot amid the blue, and disappeared. She began to weep. Great sobless tears slipped down her cheeks to sodden the white collar of her blouse. The men's voices and the crunch of heavy boots grew closer. No, she could not deal with this new thing. Not one more thing. She was finished. Let her be. Let her be like the dead. She lay down, pulled the obsidian doll to her heart, and lifted her knees and curled her body around it. Pretending to be dead, she stared into the distance in the way that her friend's eyes had stared after he died. It was hard not to blink. She felt like a big, dead baby. If she were dead, she resolved to rise into the air like the little yellow bird and then fly away into the sky forever. Time passed. She dozed, but did not know she slept. She dreamed of riding on the backs of vultures, blood dripping from her fingernails. Voices grew close, and her dream disappeared. The voices were almost on top of her. She opened her eyes. Before her were two pairs of polished black boots, dark, knobby knees, and two sharply creased pairs of identical khaki shorts. She neither moved nor spoke. Look how the cheetahs got to that one, sir. Had the cheetahs got to her? Was she dead already? That was not cheetahs, Lance Corporal. Tell that to the man whose face is eaten off. Then, fearing he had gone too far, he added, Major, sir. That was vultures, the major said. There was a moment of silence. You don't have a weak gorge, do you, Lance Corporal? No, sir, but see here, sir. Cheetah paw prints in the soft earth, and oh no, gods of my people, that woman's arm has been gnawed upon. He made a funny noise, took 3 quick steps, and vomited. Back beside the major, he said, Sorry, sir. The major continued on as if nothing had happened. The only thing missing is the hyenas. They love to eat fresh cheetah kills. The hyenas must be on the far side of the preserve. The Lance Corporal could not help himself. But, sir, he said, as if his eyes had not seen what they had just seen. Sir, cheetahs do not eat people. Not normally, no, Lance Corporal. But it has been a bad dry season. A cheetah and her half-grown cubs raided a village near mine last week and carried away a child. It happens. And it has happened here. Should I get the official camera, sir? No documentation until we get the bodies out of here. Certain higher-ups care more for the cheetahs than for the poor passengers on this plane. The big cats are endangered. as are the white-headed vultures. Both are big tourist attractions. You can be sure the truth of what happened here will never get out. Well, how will they explain the condition of the bodies, sir? They will say the passengers died in the plane crash. In your report, you will testify to the same if one day you wish to be promoted, Lance Corporal. The Lance Corporal snapped a salute, all but clicking his heels together. Yes, sir, Major, sir. I shall assign the body recovery detail, sir. You do that. You can begin with this poor child. Oh, God, I think I know her. No, it can't be. For the first time, the Major sounded disturbed. He talked as if he had a lump in his throat, a lump he could not swallow. He bent down to take a closer look. Is this Asia Jefferson? Asia Jefferson. That sounded like the name of a girl she had known once, a long, long time ago. She lay on her side, directly at his feet. Had he taken 2 steps more, he would have stepped on her. The Major observed that her body appeared unbroken. One blue-sweatered arm partly covered a rosy-cheeked face. Her white blonde hair mussed about her head. She looked angelic. At some point before she died, she must have pulled her knees to her chest, causing her blue corduroy overalls to ruck up against her pale ankles. She was barefoot. Faint blue veins curved across the arches of her oh-so-white feet. For some reason, that was what got to him. The perfect innocence of her small, bare feet. The Major made a sound, a deep noise that erupted from somewhere close to his heart. Just before he could embarrass himself before the Lance Corporal, the girl moved her arm and gave a violent sneeze. Achoo! As one, the 2 soldiers jumped back in surprise. She's alive, they said, almost in unison. It might have been comical, had there been anyone there to see. So, she was alive. She blinked and allowed her eyes to focus because now she was no longer a frozen, curled up baby. She was a real girl. She straightened her knees, which revealed the obsidian doll. Being dead was hard. Being alive, that's harder. What is this? The Lance Corporal asked in surprise as he reached for the obsidian doll. If she were not dead, then he could not take Chiambikizo. When he tried to take the doll from her, she screamed, just as if she were one of the hurt ones, one of the ones the cheetahs had found. The Lance Corporal retreated. The Major's voice drifted down to her. Let the child have it. After what she has been through. For just an instant, she was uncertain whether the Major spoke of the doll or of her. What had the doll been through? The thought made her dizzy. The Lance Corporal sounded as if he wanted to spit. Sir, that doll is old. It belongs to the African people, not this blue-eyed, blonde-headed Afrikaans child. A feeling of oldness swept over Asia. Her bones felt as if they were melting. She wished the soldiers would go away. The feeling of wanting to sleep was overpowering. No, the major said. I know this child. She is not Afrikaans. Her father is an American, a digger. He will give a reward, and I will see that you receive it. Besides, look there at the man who lies beside her. If the dead man gave that doll to her, then she is its rightful owner. To separate her from the doll would bring bad juju down on us. She clutched the doll closer. Then the soldier left. The crunching sound of his boots grew faint as he moved away. The major bent down and gathered both her and the doll into his uniformed arms. Don't worry, Asia, he whispered. I am a friend of your father's. Did the dead man there? He nodded toward the man who had been lying on the ground beside her. Give Chiambikizo to you? You can tell me. Of course. That was her name. Asia. How stupid. How could she forget her own name? In answer to his question, Asia nodded, but she didn't want to talk. She was falling asleep in his arms. From his living hand to your living hand, the major said, his voice sounding as if it came from a great distance. No one will dare to take the doll from you. If they do, they will be sorry, and she will find her way back to you. And then, as if to himself, he said, Oh, Ben Jefferson, my old friend, your daughter is the only survivor. The vultures did not touch her. The cheetahs did not touch her. They did not touch her. How will I explain this to you? How? Asia heard gunshots and jumped awake in his arms. It's all right, the major soothed. The gunshots are to scare away any vultures and cheetahs that might still be about. You were very lucky, Asia. As the major carried her toward his truck, Asia looked back over his shoulder, trying to see the face of the man who had kept her company throughout the dark night. He still lay on the ground in front of the ashes of the fire he had built for her. The strewn piles of refuse and empty overturned seats encircled his still form. In the heavy African air, smoke floated along the ground that made it difficult to see the man's face. She did not even know his name, but she would never forget his kind eyes. His head rested on his arms as if he were sleeping. Something about the way his arms were folded made him look peaceful. She hoped that he had caught up with his daughter. Asia hugged the obsidian doll. He had intended to give it to his lost daughter, but she was gone. He had given it to Asia. She looked at the doll's hanging breasts, round belly, and pudgy legs. The black stone was no longer cold. It lay warm in her hands. Asia was afraid no longer. She had Chiambikizo. She had hope.
Thanks, Gwynne. That was great.
Thanks.
So is this part of a novel or
Yeah, it's a work in progress, and I don't know if it'll be a long short story, a novella, or if the premise is strong enough to support a novel, and for all the talented authors that are out there and may one day see this, I hope that they'll send some feedback back on whether or not they think the premise is strong enough to support a novel, or should I stay with a short story?
Well, also, I mean, artist choice, right?
Yeah, true enough.
All right. Well, thanks, Gwynne.
You bet.
Okay. So let's see. I'm going to go ahead and bring Tom on. Hi,
Hello.
Tom. So what have you got for us tonight?
I have a story that I wrote for the theme Lifted. I wanted to write a story like a Roald Dahl short story, and I was also reading a bunch of Edgar Allan Poe. So we're not going to get away from death in some form of it, but hopefully it is enjoyable.
Okay. So does it have a working title?
Yes, it does. It's called The Man in Messina.
The Man in Messina. Okay.
And a quick disclaimer: this takes place in Italy, and there's Italian names, and I do not speak Italian, so I may mispronounce the names.
Okay. I'm sure somebody will call you out in the comments on that. So
Yes, perfect.
Awesome. Okay. All right.
All right. This is The Man from Messina. Whoever discovers this note and reads these words, waste not sympathy for the despicable coward here revealed. Spare only a thought for the terror which those who loved me were subjected to. Many years ago, I learned from my father's colleagues, while liquor ran aplenty, of a man in Messina who sold faces. Never had I occasion to consider this man's existence more than a trifling curiosity. Never until a period of intense heartache in my life, which would send me east to Messina to seek an answer. It was this point from which I could not return, when my once steady resolve saw fit to let grow the prospect of such a man's power, bringing to my life anything but utter, unremitting catastrophe. My cause to seek him out was love. I was born to a modest merchant class family in Palermo, some 200 kilometers west of Messina. My father, as his father before him, was a clockmaker. There remained no question his present would be my future, and I apprenticed in the ways of timepiece repair, a pastime for which I held neither affinity nor enmity. The neighborhood I called home played host to a fair number of other children my age, half of which I could hardly grow to call a friend before they were stricken from life by illness. Emerging aside me into our teens was the florist child, a girl called Beatrice, whom, from the moment I made acquaintance with her, had thoroughly enraptured my sinless heart and callow soul. Some mesmerizing locus of pure beauty resided within her. She was grace, from the way she matched each morning's warmth with her affable countenance, to her wit as sure to wring giggles from our peers as the sea breeze was to dust us in salt on the way to school. Her golden curls, fair skin, eyes, a coalition of tender generosity with ocean's wondrous blue, announced this young girl as the spark which Lucifer shies from, the resolve of Sisyphus 1,000-fold. I pledged to myself that once of age, Beatrice and I would be together, that there was no greater goal attainable than the coalescence of our souls in eternal matrimony. Unfortunately, this was not to be. Near the close of our teenage years, per her family's wishes, she was married to a fellow admirer and one I'd called friend, Giancarlo. I had little time to object, for my father had meanwhile passed away, meaning I'd inherited responsibility for the clock repair business. While learning to keep that afloat, my dear mother's own death sentenced me to solitary nights in a now empty household. And in this lonely fervor, unable to have my Beatrice, I quickly found a suitable wife in the fishmonger's daughter, a pragmatic demoiselle with short dark hair and a devoted spirit named Terina. Her trusting nature and simple upbringing made nursing my infatuation with Beatrice tolerable for my shame-ridden conscience. I knew this to be far from a permanent solution, but no quicker plan made itself known to me, and then dire news spread through Palermo. Giancarlo and Beatrice were relocating to Rome to open their own flower shop. No parting short of the gravest sins would have ever afforded Beatrice and I sufficient rapture, but I was beyond disappointed to not even garner a moment alone with my heart's possessor before she was on a ship carving north through the sea. Perhaps there could have been a way for my consciousness to avoid becoming so soaked in desperate reverence for Beatrice's rapturous beauty, but the reality lay heavy upon me until a time when nary a night passed, I in bed aside Terina, that my plum Beatrice's lustrous visage deigned not visit me by dream. I grew more certain by the day that my existence as a mere watch repairer could not sate this disastrous appetite I awoke to each morning, and that it would soon devour me whole, were not some course of action undertaken. I agonized, growing a mind of two faces at war. The self I knew was right. Sorry, are you there? Okay, sorry. I will continue. The self I knew was right, and the self I knew to truly be me. This is the current of madness which drew me back to those stories of the man in Messina who sold faces. Soon it was these delusions which provided a springboard for a plan to form in my mind, a plan in which no pastor could find violation of Holy Sacrament, a plan that afforded me the opportunity for a future spent with my life's desire while maintaining perfect peace of mind for all involved. Gathering up the last of my family's florins, I temporarily closed the shop, feigned some business motivation that necessitated my leave of the city, which Terina, in her good-natured way, paid no suspicion, and set out east along the coast. The trek to Messina demanded one traverse what was practically the entire northern latitude of the Isle Sicily, a feat which for me spanned 3 days. Once I arrived in the darling seaside commune, I made haste to the cathedral, where my hushed inquiries led me to a student visiting from the Università di Bologna, who told me a history of the man. He came from Matera, on the mainland, where the cities were carved into the very rock and stone of the hillsides. He'd lived for hundreds of years, but none could describe him, for often he played about by rearranging the faces of entire communes he visited, himself included. He was a man most audacious and clever, knowing his abilities painted him a target for scorn and zealous bigotry. Eventually, his travels led him south, where, growing weary, he found permanent refuge in the Cathedral Messina, garnering the protection of the independent conclave who presided there. This conclave would later leave the town, and that was long after the man who sold faces in his sequestration had been forgotten. It wasn't until another 100 years had passed, when the younger Company of Strasbourg, France, had been commissioned by the Archbishop to install a grand astronomical clock in the cathedral, alike the one in Prague, did the man reappear with a new aim, to sell his ability to those who sought it. At this point, the student's voice went low, and he hunched forward over the table. So, my friend, do you seek an audience with him? My head bobbed vigorously before I had mind to respond otherwise, and by nightfall, I was alone in the cathedral's clock tower at the appointed time, clutching my bag of florins, shivering in the altitudinous winds. When the witch's hour tolled, the great tower's bells sounded, and just as the student described, a figure emerged from the darkness, hunched, draped, and hooded in cloth of black. Upon disclosing his face, I was shocked to see the aspect of an irrefutably handsome man, much like the beardless Hercules which adorns many artists' marble renditions across Italy. You come to purchase a face, came his voice, rasped and sudden above the ringing bells, but from where it came I knew not, for the handsome face under the hood moved not 1 centimeter. In fact, the eyes were set upon me like black olives floating in oil, lifeless points in an unmoving mask. He slid forward and extended a hand from beneath the black robe. It was the gnarled, pock-marked hand of a decrepit old man. Payment, he said. I placed the bag of florins in his hand. The banging of the bells in the clock tower wrung my very skull. Tell me what face you wish to have. It is not I who I wish to purchase a face for, but my wife, I told him. I want to purchase the face of my one true love, Beatrice di Castignari in Rome, and affix it to my wife, Terina di Moscatina in Palermo. His frozen, dead eyes stared at me. A face, once lifted, sets he said. And a sun, once set, carries not the horizon. I understand, replied I, not quite understanding. At this, he nodded a single time, a gesture pregnant with some meaning the likes of which also escaped me. Set out for home tomorrow morning. Upon your arrival, your wife's face will be that of your love's. I hesitated. There's nothing more to be done. She need not drink any concoction, smear, ointment upon her skin. It will be done, he said, terse. With that, he retreated back into the shadows, and as the last striking of the cathedral's bell sounded, vanished from my sight. My journey home from Messina saw me so fevered with unflagging fantasies that I bordered on ravenous delirium. I could think of nothing over those 3 days except the images of Beatrice that had visited me time and again in my dreams, of her beautiful golden locks falling across her pale bosom as she presses herself to me, whispers of radiance in my ear before unleashing Eden's grandeur upon me. Once in Palermo, I wasted no time getting to my home. The front door caved under my boots' blow as I made way into the parlor, shouting at the top of my lungs, "Wife, good wife, I am home, come quickly." Terina emerged into the front room. She looked upon me, doleful. "Remo, my husband, I know not what brought it about, but my countenance, it has changed." Her eyes glazed with tears. "Please, spare not your restraint. Tell me, am I no longer acceptable to you?" She will have seen the shock in my own expression, for what unfolded before me was at once what I expected and not what I expected. The face was indeed that of my love, Beatrice. It was just as I remembered seeing her on spring mornings, carrying her basket of honeysuckle across the facade of my family's clock shop, waving in at me, beaming a warmth all heat pales to. But the hair upon her head was the dark, short-cut hair Terina had always worn. The eyebrows above Beatrice's blue gold, blue eyes were blonde, while the hair, not but inches above that, was dark as raven's wings. The incongruity of this was enough to bring a lock to my step, and I gaped, dumbstruck by the childish stupidity of my anticipation. Of course, the man had not replaced her hair. I had only asked him to replace her face. It was my own proclivities which made me expect a golden-haired angel. "My dear wife," said I, drawing forth words from what felt like an ever-receding memory of a past life. "My dear Terina, what nonsense grips you? You are beauty incarnate, and I endeavor to show it to you." Anticipation in that moment unmasked itself for what it really had been the previous 3 days: carnal lust. I took Beatrina, as I had resolved in my head to call her new combined form long before even making it to Messina, in my arms, tore the dress from her shoulders, and wiped the tears from her face. I placed my hands upon her hairline so that below them was the portrait of the woman I had pursued my entire life, and kissed her. From then until next morning, Beatrina could barely eke out an inquiry into how my week-long trip had fared, for I kept her wrapped in our bedsheets, body entangled with mine, pressed closely, gasping and moaning through Beatrice's harbor sunset lips. The following week was euphoria. I extended my shop's holiday and made love to Beatrina, who did not question this renewed intensity, but did refuse my insistence she wear a blonde wig of curls I had purchased. Multiple times a day, always facing her, always staring into the eyes which I'd coveted for so long, which had sailed across the Tyrrhenian to its life without me. I thought of nothing except my triumph over Providence, that from fate's tightened fists I'd wrenched my own fortune in my own way. Yes, it was all thanks to the man who sold faces, but I made no recompense. This was my victory. When the next week arrived, I reopened the shop, but could observe a creeping discomfort through the day. My work was lacking. Nothing felt of any consequence, for each order or request that came through seemed nothing more than a series of metals and glass and gears that would eventually stop working. I saw no point to it, and was soon failing to get orders back to customers on time, never mind early. My days' doldrums leaked into my nights, and soon, where unparalleled ecstasy had been the night's reserve, now depression and despair stepped in. It wasn't just my work. It wasn't just Palermo without Beatrice. It wasn't even Terina refusing the blonde wig. By week's end, I'd pinpointed the culprit. Beatrice's face did not fit on Terina. That is to say, the mannerisms one accumulates over a lifetime, while microscopic when viewed singularly, amount to a much larger pastiche of appearance, air, mood, just as brushstrokes in a painting contribute to its theme. Terina had not spent her life with the face of an unquestionable beauty. She was not used to glances from passers-by. She knew not how to work the muscles in her face to produce the expressions which one needed express when they are deserving of a certain tier of awe. Beatrice had tended flowers, delicate, colorful, alive, while Terina had spent her life gutting cold, dead fish with her father. To these small inconsistencies, I could not force myself into ignorance, and just as the inner mechanisms of clocks and timepieces had begun to lose any grip on my interest, so too did Beatrina, and her absence of aura I hadn't thought was necessary. But it was necessary. I knew that now. Oh, I had made a mistake, a grave mistake, one I could not voice to Terina. What had been a triumph was now a disaster. I grew sickened by the sight of my wife, only able to regard her exhibition of that face as a mockery to the memory of it. At once I knew this to be a sickness within myself, just as my lethargy toward work was. Soon I could not stay in our home when Beatrina was there, and instead stayed out gambling and drinking, spending the last of our savings to keep myself in a haze after having paid the lion's share of it to the man in Messina. I could only feel pity for Terina, that her love still motivated her to draw Beatrice's eyes away from my drunken conduct in favor of propping me up with Terina's shoulder. We ran out of money. Terina borrowed from friends and families, and I spent it. She tried to get me back to work, and I instead trampled her trust by piddling the time away in favor of misery. Before long, I could bear her strength and support no more, for my sorrow and hatred of myself grew much too heavy to accept anyone's assistance. While lying in the sands of the Mondelo beach after a night of drinking, I decided to end what had become of my life. Yes, end it all, but not without final reprieve. One last bastion of hope. I must venture across the Tyrrhenian to Rome, and once more glimpse my sapphic angel in all her breathtaking radiance. After that, I would swallow a jug of port and throw myself into the ocean. This meant abandoning my wife, Terina, and the clock shop my family had operated for 5 generations. But as far as I was concerned, my disappearance would be good for Terina. She would no longer need deal with me and could remarry a gentleman of actual scruples, who wouldn't fold his honor for the love of phantasms. Yes, I was not meant for this life. I looked east toward Messina, at the pink light leaking over the sea. What did a sun once set, now rising, carry? I staggered to the harbor, where in exchange for working the oars, I gained passage on a ship sailing for Naples that very morning. The journey to Naples lasted 2 days, whereupon I secured a post in another merchant vessel onward to Rome. Just as I had on my journey back to Palermo from Messina, I imagined Beatrice in all her luminosity. I imagined getting to hear her voice one more time, smell her floral tea scent, glimpse her golden curls. I must have appeared mad to the other oarsmen, a senile young man trapped in his memories, staring into space for hours on end as we pressed and pulled. Upon arriving in Rome, I made my way to the address Beatrice had sent letters from, the flower shop she operated with her husband, Giancarlo. I ran, still reeking of the merchant vessel's whole basin, stumbling across passers-by, caring not to match their incensed looks with apologies. She was in my grasp. I made it to the flower shop's acid-etched glass front door, through which I caught sight of a swirl of golden blonde. Convulsions nearly caused me to swallow my tongue. Yes, she was there. It was her. Finally, I could once again bask in her beauty before spending my afterlife eternally suffering. I flung the door open. Behind the counter, back turned, hair pinned up, a woman arranged a basket of Martagon lilies. I approached the counter. "Beatrice," I said. Her back straightened. "Is that?" she said. "Yes," I replied, "it's me." And she turned around. Just as I had been assaulted by the appearance of my wife wearing Beatrice's face when I first returned to Palermo from Messina, here too, I was struck dumb, for Beatrice's face was not there. In its place was not Terina's face, nor another woman's face, nor any other face at all. It was nothing, a blank, a simple sheaf of smooth, pale skin. Where the features I'd memorized should be, the perfectly shaped brow, the ocean eyes, the picturesque nose, was two sunken patches of skin that suggested eyes, between which a protrusion imitated a nose with no nostrils. Above her jawline, where a mouth would be, was a razor-thin slit, out of which a voice squirmed, a voice that was somehow Beatrice's voice, the voice I knew. Yes? The way the slit undulated to speak was sickening. There were no teeth, no tongue. I swayed where I stood, unbelieving of what I was seeing. This could not be true. This couldn't be my Beatrice, the one from all those years before. I'm sorry, who? She said, the slit contorting again. I grew queasy at the sight of the sunken skin of her eyes gesticulating. Even while the ground spun beneath me, I heard my own voice wisp out into the air. Beatrice? Beatrice di Castignari from Palermo? There were no features on her face to express any sort of emotion. The pale mask simply remained motionless before the slit parted once more. Yes, that's me. You can't be, I heard myself saying. I knew not whether this was truly the state my love had come to, perhaps through some horrific accident and medical procedures, or if I myself had finally made it past sanity's point of no return. You have no face. Pardon me? She said, and I shuddered. My body retched and I turned away, unable to withstand it any longer. Like the true coward I am, I fled the shop, running as if chased by unrelenting beasts or that future of suffering now bearing down on me. I made it to a nearby bush and I vomited. Sir, a young girl's voice near me said, are you unwell? I drew my sleeve across my face and turned. The child wore a freshly laundered cerulean dress, clutching a stuffed animal. But where her face should have been was nothing. Just as Beatrice's facial features had been replaced by expressionless grafts of skin, so too was this little girl's. I lurched away from the little girl toward the tall windows of a bank on the other side of the plaza. I needed to look in them. I needed to see. I gripped each successive person I passed, pleading for them to have a face, yet all of them were the same, faceless, unmoving blanks. Despairing, I threw myself against the bank's windows. I drew myself up and sought my reflection. Did it extend to me, this horror? Would that be so wrong even if it did? Would it be so unexpected? Did I not deserve worse than the exhuming of my features I used to call my own? In the window, instead of my reflection, I caught sight of a man in a suit, staring directly out at me from inside. This man was unlike the others. This man didn't lack a face. His was the same handsome, unmoving, face-like mask the man in Messina had underneath his cowl. Him? How? What was he doing here? Was this all his doing for his amusement? The handsome-faced man watched me fall to my knees under the weight of these questions. Indeed, I was not made for this world. Pursuing beauty, it was not to be for an ignoble soulless such as myself. Somewhere nearby, a clock tower's bell resounded, ringing out through the air, free, unhindered, and the man who sold faces nodded a single nod once at me. His mouth didn't move, but I could hear a voice. This face, now lifted, will set. Thank you very much. That is the end.
All right. Thanks, Tom. That was, I don't know. Doesn't sound like that relationship went good places.
Maybe not.
But, oh well. Sometimes that's just how it goes. Anyway, I mean, I'm sure that this is all autobiographical.
Not in the slightest.
All right. Well, I will let you go for now. And next up, we have my wild friend, Sue, who also goes by Lily Lapin. Or is it Lapin?
Lapin, you're right.
Ah, may we. Okay. Well, what have you got for us tonight?
Hey, first I wanted to say, Tom, that was really wild. It totally reminded me of a Twilight Zone I saw 1,000 years ago. And also Edgar Allan Poe, totally, really great. And tonight I have fresh starts in 2 parts. I wrote for the Pikes Peak anthology. So I'm going to read that. I'm reading 2 parts of it. The first part was published in the anthology and the other wasn't, but I'm going to read the whole thing. So you guys ready?
I am ready.
Okay. So fresh starts in 2 parts. Part 1, vomitorium. Vomitorium. One sec. Vomitorium. Noun. Number 1. Each of a series of entrance or exit passages in an ancient Roman amphitheater or theater. 2. A place in which, according to popular misconception, the ancient Romans are supposed to have vomited during feasts to make room for more food. Lexico, powered by Oxford. This first essay concerns itself with the word vomitorium as it has been misconstrued. In 1971, when I graduated from high school in a small town 11 miles south of Philadelphia, I distinctly did not move to New York City. Rather, I planned to loop around it, taking a temporary detour. Averting my eyes to shield them from the city's blinding glare, I considered New England. It simply seemed less daunting. Growing up, I'd had a few flings with New York, like a girl playing at house or baking in an easy bake oven, mimicking motherhood. When I was 13, my mother took my brother and me there for a week. We stayed at the plaza, like the character in the Eloise story. My mother later said she spent the money she'd brought to last for the entire trip in the first day. We went downtown to the village where I bought a pair of railroad stripe hip hugger bell bottom jeans. In my new jeans, I walked ahead of my mother and brother. I was a cool local girl, only to turn to find they disappeared around a corner, engaged in a debate about going to the then landmark FAO Schwartz toy store. Cool girl? Not so much. I had no idea where I was. When I was 14, I met a bunch of New York and North Jersey Jewish kids at summer camp. Al, the waiter from Flushing, he was a camp waiter, hence the name, developed a crush on me. He'd offer me extra potato latkes and tuck socialist literature into my sleeping bag on the bottom bunk. I hung with the Malarkey sisters, one CIT, a year older, one camper like me, a year younger, me sandwiched in the middle. When I visited Al in 9th grade, we all met up in the city and sneaked into a Simon and Garfunkel concert at Lincoln Center. Climbing the steps to the very back of the concert hall as the duo started to sing The Sound of Silence, we were so far away their heads appeared dime-sized. It didn't matter. They were magnificent. New York. But moving there on my own? No way. Still, I didn't want to get stuck so close to home. I wanted something new and challenging, just not two. My godmother, a free spirit, offered me a ride to Boston. I piled my stuff into her white, black-topped convertible Mustang, and we were off. It broke my mother's heart. Boston. Boston turned into a 12-year detour. I waitressed at multiple muffin shops. I got increasingly blasé about muffins, while dragging myself through a fine arts degree Realizing it had been a waste, returning to school to study commercial art, more practical. This was pre-computer. Our tools were X-Acto knives and wax. I fell in love, failed at love, slept around, fell in love again, emerging at 26, a married woman with a moderately successful commercial art career and a low-level cocaine habit. By the time my then husband dragged me out of Boston, confessing years later, only after our divorce was finalized, he'd initially moved to escape the addiction, I was cresting 30. We deposit ourselves in an annoying suburban Connecticut town, 7/10 of a mile, I clocked it, from my in-laws who despised me. As the feeling assumed mutuality, I came out of the closet a full-blown agoraphobic. Still, I was that much closer to New York City. The city was slowly reeling me in, clarifying its intention to become destiny. A formidable force, New York has a way of doing that. You can only deny it for so long, if I could just get myself out the front door. After much in front of mere self-persuasion, repeated before each outing, I gained not a shred of confidence. I'd set out for the city, drive to the downtown Connecticut train station, timidly park obscurely in remote parking, and shaking the whole way walk to catch the train into Grand Central on 42nd Street. Once there, the further I walked away from the station, I could not work up the nerve to descend below to the subway platform. The more I shed the skin of suburban commuter and embraced the disguise of native New Yorker. I was set on trying to get a show. All these years after art school, where I barely hung on, my work had come into its own. 3D collage and dioramas. Trudging around the city, I'd take my slides from gallery to gallery. There they laughed at me, or I was snubbed. I wasn't sure which was worse. After fruitless encounters, I'd flee east on 42nd Street before I turned back into a country pumpkin to Grand Central, back to Podunk, Connecticut. Once there, like a crab, I'd scuttle to my car, soon to be hitting the garage door opener and entering the cave-like sanctuary. There, I'd routinely hyperventilate in the dark before emerging from the car and barricading myself inside the house. One trip back, I'll never forget. It was a turning point. Summer, hot. I was walking east on 42nd towards the station behind a tall, stiletto-heeled woman. White minisuit, Tina Turner hair, hip-swinging, long-legged runway stride. I can never wear white. Stains are magnetically drawn to me as to a blank canvas, nor does white flatter the dull shade of my teeth. Abruptly, she stopped. I did too hesitant to pass her. Expertly, she turned her head to the right and vomited, daintily wiping her mouth with a hanky she deftly pulled from her bag. I'd never seen a person vomit so artfully. It was like a cartoon vomit. The vomit arced out from her mouth, clearing her ensemble, and in one mass landed softly on the sidewalk like a baby being tucked in. And I'd never seen vomit so pristine, white, or maybe ivory, shaped like fluffy cumulus clouds. When I throw up, there was always the sad visual of my latest meals mixed together in a fashion that is just wrong. What had this woman been eating? Nectar of the gods, a slice of heaven, perfect vomit, spit up in perfect form by a native New Yorker. "Are you okay?" I called out as I ran towards her. She did not turn or answer, as if I was opening my mouth, but no sound escaped. She'd barely paused, and now she was in full strut again, not rushing, just heading east. And I was left alone beside her expertly placed white pile of vomit. Fresh starts, lesson 1. That's when I got it. The moment she stepped away, it was no longer she who'd puked. As for me, as long as I stood there, I was assuming the identity of her vomit. It took me a few minutes to let it sink in. It was so surreal. I wondered if it had even happened. Then I started walking east. Soon it was as if I had never even been there. When the train arrived in Connecticut, I started out to the remote parking lot where I'd stashed my car. The heat beat down. There was no sound, no one around. Probably folks sheltered inside, hiding from the oppressive summer day. As I passed the first dusty, unpaved parking lot, the interior of a parked car spontaneously burst into flame. Odd. Pre-cell phone. As I walked, I looked about. No payphone in sight, nobody yelling fire. I could scream and no one would likely hear me. I did not break my stride. I did not look back. The further away I got, the less connected I became to the event. I never did hear the car explode. Fresh starts, lesson 2. That day I knew, next trip in, like a native New Yorker, I'd make the descent into the bowels of the New York City subway system. Part 2, mindful commuting. After 3 years of suffering insufferable in-laws, we'd lived 7/10 of a mile away, remember? I'd clocked it. Even my own parents had finally refused to socialize with them. We left Connecticut. I can still remember the rush I felt as I swung onto the Fort Lee Hudson Terrace exit after crossing the George Washington Bridge, my 4 cats and 2 rabbits tucked into my car. Hoboken, New Jersey, just like I pictured it. I've never felt prouder than when I attached my Jersey plates. And at this point, New York City and me, well, we were neighbors. My marriage didn't last long after that, but moving to New Jersey was the beginning of the rest of my life. 9/11. I had just arrived at the Hoboken Path Station. A crowd of commuters milled about, eyes cast across the river to downtown New York, like meerkats, their communal gaze on guard for predators. I followed their stare to the tall building out of which flames leapt. What happened? I turned to the person next to me. A plane hit the tower. Oh my God, like that one. The crowd moaned their collective shock. I turned to see the second building burning. I screamed. I ran. Anywhere away from there. From that morning, I stopped taking the path to my job in New York. I preferred to remain above ground, on water. Inhaling the smell of brackish spray, we made waves across the Hudson on the brief ferry ride from the Hoboken 14th Street Ferry Terminal to the west side of Midtown Manhattan. Soon, I began taking my black Trek hybrid bike on the ferry. I'd ride uptown along the river, turning east on 48th Street to Rock Plaza, a good start to the morning. In my Trek's 17th year, several years after I'd begun my routine ferry bike commute, I had it rehabbed. New brakes, new gears, new tires, the works. Soon after, right before Christmas, it was stolen from the bike rack outside the Time Life building. I was devastated. I bought a cheap bike on Craigslist. On my commute home, I'd veer off into the west side streets in futile search of my bike, or at least pieces of it. As my new used bike deconstructed itself, losing seat, a pedal, running generally rough, I ransacked my brain for what to do. Never, never, never again would I lock a bike outside in New York City. But what then? One late afternoon, on my way home, the resolution presented itself. A thin, young man wheeled an odd bike onto the ferry. Both he and the bike looked like they stepped out of a circus. He moved like a mime in pantomime. The tiny wheeled bike was built on an A-frame. Excuse me, I nodded. Excusez-moi, he motioned. He was French. Your bicyclette? I stumbled through a rough approximation of French. Bowing, he put his hand to his ear and cocked his head. He was deaf. French and deaf. I pointed to his bike. Oui, yes, yes, she is Strida. English bifold bike, he enunciated carefully. When the ferry docked, we nodded to each other enthusiastically. Strida. I gave him a thumbs up. Oui, Strida. I watched as he unfolded the bike. It took seconds and pedaled off. An English bifold bike called Strida, like Strider in The Lord of the Rings, ridden by a mercurial, deaf Frenchman who I happened to run into after my beloved trek was taken. It was a sign. Strida, able to be taken into tall buildings. No bike stolen again, ever. Fresh starts. At that moment, it became the bike for me. That's it.
Hello. Okay. Made it back. Well, thanks, Sue. That was great. And I love your voice. You've got just such a great, great voice and such a good sense of humor. So,
It was just interesting that every story so far had vomit in it.
yeah, we're on a vomit trend tonight.
I know it's a little freaky.
All right. Let's see. So I've got Julia here. All right. So, well, I'm not going to ask if your story has vomit in it, so we'll just wait.
It doesn't, and it also doesn't have any vampires in it, so it's a very unusual story for me. So.
Oh, wow. No vomit, no vampires. Okay. All right. Well, I will let you take it away.
Okay. Written in the stars. As I staggered in my front door with a load of snow-covered logs, two things grabbed my attention. The first was the heady fragrance of pumpkin pie baking. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, the very essence of family holiday. The second was a loud argument taking place upstairs. I set the logs down in the big basket next to the fireplace and hung up my coat. The raised voices were easy to recognize. They came from my wife, Kathy, and Veronica, our 17-year-old daughter. The two almost never argued. Ronnie and Kathy had none of the mother-daughter clashes I'd heard other parents describe. Now, the day before Thanksgiving, with a house full of relatives coming, a crisis was erupting upstairs. I wanted to run up the stairs, burst in, and make some light-hearted remark that would de-escalate the war of words, but hesitated. I had a feeling I might be the reason for the argument. Or not me exactly, but what had happened to me over 2 decades ago. We were 4 good friends, all young men in our mid-20s, starting out in careers, all outdoor nuts. On a mild June night in western Massachusetts, as we sat by our campfire under the stars, we were visited by beings from another planet. Though each of us had memory gaps about exactly what had taken place, none of us had a shred of doubt that we 4 had had a close encounter of the 4th kind. In other words, we had been taken by extraterrestrials to their spaceship and used in their experiments. Now, I don't go around handing out brochures about UFOs or telling people to watch the skies. But on the other hand, if someone asks me what happened, I tell them the truth. I'm incapable of lying, a characteristic that has cost me friends and a promising career. Honest to a fault, as they say, thanks to my father, the judge. When I was in 2nd grade, I'd told my teacher I had a sister and a brother. This was mere wishful thinking on my part. I was the only child of divorced parents, and my father had sole custody. The teacher mentioned the mythical siblings at a parent-teacher conference. The judge didn't say a word about it at the time. A few days later, he picked me up from school and drove me to the state penitentiary. He took me by the hand and led me to a big metal door. A guard opened it. He had a surprised look on his face when he saw me, but didn't dare say a word to the judge. My father and I followed the guard into a small dark room with a big glass wall, curtained on one side. We sat in the front row, along with some other grown-ups. I could tell by their whispers they were surprised to see me too. The curtains parted, and I saw a man lying on a bed with tubes coming out of his arms. On one side of him was a man in a white coat. Then my father bent down next to my ear. "Watch closely, Henry," he told me. "This is what happens to people who tell lies." I shook off the horrific memory and called to mind my 3 absent friends. The Amagansett Four, as the tabloids called us, were unlikely companions. We'd gotten acquainted as we stood in an endless line to buy fishing licenses earlier that same year. The bureaucracy in our state results in long lines and boatloads of paperwork. As we inched forward, Rudy had made some joke about there being a reason our state is called Taxachusetts. We'd talked about money and weather and then about the fishing season that lay ahead. When we finally emerged from the county office into the spring sunlight, Tim suggested we get a beer across the street at the Bayberry Inn. After nearly 2 hours in line, the rest of us thought it was a brilliant idea. By the second beer, the 4 of us had made plans to go fishing the following Saturday at Silver Lake. It was to be the first of many weekend fishing trips. Tim was the oldest of us. He was a dentist who'd moved to East Falmouth and opened an office 3 years prior. His wife, Barb, was pregnant with their first child. Will and Rudy were twin brothers. Will was a roofer and Rudy a heavy equipment operator. They worked for their father, a general contractor in West Falmouth. Will was newly married to a girl named Susan. He and Rudy had both courted her, and Will had won her. Rudy was the only single, the only bachelor among us. He liked to joke that he was drinking to forget, but it was only partly a joke. That summer, I was a new graduate of Harvard Business School, and like Will, a newlywed, I'd landed a great job with an investment bank in Boston and commuted an hour and back from the Cape every day. It was worth it to come home to Kathy and the sanctuary of our little Cape Cod house, nestled in the woods. My father, the eminent Judge Barstow Mills, lived in solitary splendor, less than an hour away down Cape. I had a good life, and now I had 3 new friends. The night of the abduction, we met at Tim's house in East Sandwich. After we had the usual argument over which vehicles to take and made sure we had enough beer to last the weekend, we said goodbye to our wives. They'd rented a stack of chick flicks from Blockbuster and had a fridge full of wine coolers. No doubt they were looking forward to the weekend as much as we were. Tim got in my BMW and Rudy hopped in Will's pickup. We weren't going too far, about 60 miles to the north to Amagansett State Park. I knew of an unmarked road there that would take us beyond the main camping area, away from tourists, and not far from a sweet little crystal lake brimming with cutthroat trout. About an hour and a half later, we were there. We all piled out and started setting up camp. Rudy had had a couple of Labatts already, and he was belting out that damn song about a rainbow in the dark. We put him to work gathering firewood while the rest of us pitched tents and got the fishing gear out, ready for the next morning. We didn't know it then, but we wouldn't catch anything. We were the ones who got caught. Dark had fallen by the time Rudy tromped back, carrying 5 huge logs he'd scavenged in the woods. His face flushed with pride as he laid them on top of the pile of branches we'd set on fire after pitching our tents. "These'll burn for hours," he crowed. We lit the fire, opened more beers, and cooked the steaks Tim had brought, then made plans for an early start the next morning. It was a clear, starry night. I'd checked the weather before we left. No meteor shower had been predicted. That's what made me look up first. A shooting star streaked across the sky, then another and another. The stars kept coming faster and brighter until they blurred together into a whirling disk of light. By then, we were all staring up in wonder. It hovered directly overhead, brighter than 1,000 suns, and humming so loud I thought my skull would burst. The last thing I remember was the terror on the faces of my friends as we all sat there, frozen, holding our hands over our ears. Those logs, as predicted, must have burned for hours. When I came to, dawn was streaking the sky over Lake Amagansett, and the fire was a pile of smoking embers. We sat up, looked at each other in our rumpled, dew-soaked clothes, and wondered how we'd fallen asleep there. None of us had drunk more than 2 beers, as evidenced by the empties around us. When we stood, we were stiff and sore, but wrote it off to sleeping on the ground. Not much was said, other than we all wanted to cut the trip short. Somehow, each of us knew something out of the ordinary had happened, but none of us had a clear memory, and none of us knew how to talk about it or wanted to. We packed up quickly and got out of there. After we got home to our wives and our normal routines, that's when the 4 of us began to truly remember. That's when the night terrors began. Now I stood at the bottom of the stairs, listening to Kathy's low, sweet voice and Ronnie crying. As I made up my mind to go up and talk to them, Ronnie burst out of her bedroom, clutching a backpack, and rushed down the stairs past me. "Not so fast, sweetheart. Where are you off to?" I called to her. She wheeled around, her tear-streaked face striking a pang deep in my chest. "I don't want to be here tomorrow, Dad." "And this Thanksgiving with the whole family coming?" She shook her head, clutching her parka closed. "It'll be just like every year. Why can't we be normal like other families?" With that, she was out the door, running for the battered old Volvo she'd bought with her own money. "Let her have some space." Kathy came down the stairs. "She'll go visit her best friend. They'll talk, and she'll calm down. And then she'll come home." "What in God's name were you 2 arguing about?" Kathy said nothing at first. Then she sighed, laid a hand on my arm, and looked up at me. "You know, she loves you, Henry." I did know this. Ronnie had grown up being teased by other kids about her dad and his little green friends. Small town Massachusetts is just like small town anywhere in the world. Ronnie had stood up to those who made fun of me, even punching one little boy in the nose when she heard him making fun of me on the playground. Ronnie the lion-hearted, loyal and brave. By the time she was in middle school, talk of the abduction only resurfaced now and then when some reporter would show up and ask me for an interview, or, God forbid, would start asking questions of other people in town. Then it would all come up again. And as Ronnie got older, I knew she wished desperately, like all teenagers, to be like her peers. Next spring, she would graduate. I hoped when she got to college, she could put it all behind her. Never once did Ronnie blame or criticize me, and neither did Kathy, who never asked the one question most wives surely would have: if I was certain whether it had happened. Kathy had held me through the terrifying nightmares that started the very first night after I returned. That summer morning, Kathy had been a little surprised to see me, but she was glad, too. We were still newlyweds. That night, I lay down gratefully, glad to be in my own bed and happy to see Kathy asleep next to me. The sheets were crisp and cool. I looked out the window at the star-filled sky above the dense canopy of trees. For a second, I felt a spike of fear. I had just enough time to wonder why before I fell into a deep slumber. I was standing at the fireside. My 3 friends were standing also. All 4 of us were staring up at the blazing light humming directly above us. From the center of the brightness, beams of even brighter light, pink, blue, and green, shot down to where we stood and strobed about us. There was a sudden sensation of falling, but falling upwards. We were inside the ship, looking wildly about us. Everything in sight was either white or silver, and so bright I tried to cover my eyes. My hands seemed to weigh hundreds of pounds. I couldn't lift them from my sides, and I couldn't speak. We all stared at each other, our eyes the only part of our bodies that could move. Tall figures blotted out the light, encircling us. A long, spindly arm with impossibly long fingers came towards me. I was powerless to move. The gray fingertips touched my face, tentatively at first, then attached themselves like suction. I screamed with all the force I could muster, but no sound came out. "Henry, what's wrong?" I awoke in a cold sweat. Kathy was sitting up, staring at me with an anxious expression. I guess I had a nightmare. It was the first of many. The next morning was Sunday. I called Tim. I could tell as soon as he came on the line that he wasn't his usual self. No sense in beating about the bush. How'd you sleep last night, buddy? I asked him. The silence on the end told me all I needed to know. At last he answered, not so great. How about you? I had a nightmare, a pretty bizarre one. Yeah, so did I. I waited, but he didn't elaborate. Tim, you dream about what happened in the alien ship? Yeah. A sense of relief washed over me. I wasn't alone. I hadn't imagined it. Then my heart skipped a beat. What had happened to the four of us really had been true. I'm going to call Rudy and Will, I told him. Let me know what they say. I agreed, and I told him I'd call him back. Before I could dial either number, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to Rudy. Henry, we gotta talk. We both spoke at the same time, asking each other whether we'd had a bad dream. At any other time, it would have been funny. Not today. We sat at the kitchen table. Rudy was pale and had huge bags under his eyes. Have you talked to Will? I asked him. Yeah, how about Tim? I talked to him. He remembers too. Jesus, Henry, what are we going to do? I stared at him. Do? What do you mean? Who can we tell about this? I think we should get Tim and Will over here and decide. Less than 30 minutes later, we were all huddled over coffee. We'd all had similar nightmares. The difference was in the details. Tim remembered lying on a table and having four of the tall gray ones standing around him with instruments in their hands. Rudy had a memory of some kind of injection. He pulled up his sleeve and showed us a needle mark. Will sat listening to us, avoiding eye contact. Finally, Rudy grabbed his shoulder and shook him. Will jumped up and took a swing at Rudy, missing as his brother ducked. Then he broke down crying. They violated me, he told us between sobs. Jesus God, they put their instruments in every opening I have. Kathy was standing in the doorway, pale and frightened. Knowing she'd overheard, I called her in, and we four went over what had happened at Amagansett Lake, adding details. She didn't say a word until all of us had finished. Then she came up with a brilliant suggestion. Each of us would seek out a psychologist. That way, the burden of deciding what had happened that night would be shared with four independent professionals. 4 different psychologists interviewed us and hypnotized us. While I was under, I tried to draw pictures of the inside of the alien ship and of the symbols I'd seen on their instrument panels. The same pictures and symbols that Will, Rudy, and Tim drew in 3 other psychologists' offices. Pictures that one of these so-called professionals leaked to the tabloids, and so we became the Amagansett 4. After the storm of publicity died down, Tim, Rudy, and Will had moved on, as they called it. They'd chosen never to speak to the press about it. Not many patients would want to visit a dentist who talked about motherships and intergalactic travel, or hire a roofer with memories of bizarre medical experiments, or letting a man who admitted to having been sexually violated by the Greys and had PTSD from it operate a front loader for their construction firm. But to me, denying the abduction felt like a lie. So I was interviewed many, many times. After a few months, the investment banking firm of Smith, Wainthropp & French let me know my services would no longer be needed. They might have been able to overlook the paparazzi camped outside their Boylston Avenue headquarters, and they might have forgiven how many times I'd come in late. Night after night that first year, when I closed my eyes, I saw the Greys coming close to me, putting their long, cold fingers on my face. Always the same, the gentle caress as they found the 2 sides of my skull, and then the searing pain as they searched my brain. I'd wake from those dreams with migraine headaches, dazed and confused. Then my work began to suffer. I'd be on the phone with the New York Stock Exchange, and the fluorescent overhead lights would seem to brighten or dim and the temperature to drop, and I'd be back on the ship, just like that. I'd forget what I was saying. Once or twice, I dropped the phone and just sat staring at the ceiling. After I screwed up several trades with multiple zeros in them in the accounts of major clients, the management team had no choice. As I stood outside the stately building with the contents of my desk in a cardboard box, I remembered my high school graduation and the judge's prediction. I'm proud of you, son. You've done well, and you have a great future ahead of you. He clapped me on the back, and then he froze. At the back of the crowd, a woman smiled right at me, making eye contact, and waggled her fingers. Somehow, I knew who she was. Father, is that? His lips compressed to a thin line. Yes, Henry, that's the woman who gave birth to you. I can't believe she had the gall to show up here. The slight figure was moving away. My mother knew my father had seen her, and she hastened toward the exit. I started after her. The judge's hand shot out and gripped my arm. That woman is a liar and a cheat. She has no place in my life or yours. I stood there, stunned at the vehemence in his voice. All my life I'd wondered where my mother had gone and why she'd abandoned us. Now I knew why. He had banished her, cut her out of his life like a cancerous tumor. In that moment, I hated him. Look at me, Henry. You're a good boy. You've never lied to me or to anyone else that I know of. His eyes were moist, the closest I ever saw him come to emotion. I thought of the years he'd spent raising me and the deep hurt my mother must have caused him. Promise me you'll always tell the truth. My voice was a hoarse whisper. I always will. After a few sessions, all three of my friends quit going to their psychologists. As the months and years passed, they managed to convince themselves that it had been a mass hallucination, despite the fact that none of us were drunk or stoned that night under the summer stars. All three of them denied the experience that had ever happened. I was the only holdout. When I met with my father the first time after the abduction, the judge had listened to me tell the story as unemotionally as he did when a plea was before him. He took the drawings and transcripts of the 4 hypnosis sessions from me and shut himself in his office for a couple of hours, leaving me to wander through the cold, dimly lit rooms I'd grown up in. At last, he called me in. Henry, this is an incredible story. I agreed. As strange as it might be, it seems it's true. 4 independent psychologists recorded similar accounts. His steely gaze bored into me. That being the case, you will have to decide how to live the rest of your life in light of this experience. I stared back at him. There would be no recanting the story for me. I could keep it to myself unless I was asked about it, but I could never deny it, not while the judge still lived, and not while I cared what he thought about me. Kathy's words brought me back to the present. Ronnie will be all right, she told me again. Her arms slid around my waist, and I held her close. Will she? I wondered. What will happen tomorrow when the subject comes up again? Every year we hosted the family Thanksgiving dinner, and every year the judge took inventory by asking everyone at the searching questions about their lives. My glance strayed to the mantelpiece where Ronnie's photograph in her long black youth symphony gown had pride of place. And what about next June, on the 25th anniversary of the Amagansett Lake abductions? They'd left me alone for several years, but I knew the reporters would be back. I'd already had phone calls and emails asking for interviews. Next June, when my daughter graduates from high school and the reporters show up like bad fairies at her celebration. Kathy and I were busy the rest of the evening doing prep for the next day's feast. I mixed the brine we used every year, and together we lowered the huge turkey into the cooler. I helped find the matching harvest placemats, napkins, and serving pieces. 9 o'clock came, then 10. We sat at the kitchen table together, polishing the silver. At last, Ronnie came home. As Kathy had predicted, she was calm. I went to Sandy's, she told us, looking from her mother's face to mine. I thought that's where you'd gone, said Kathy, giving her a warm smile. Is her family having company for Thanksgiving? No, it's just the 4 of them. For a moment, Ronnie seemed about to say something else. Then she summoned up that strength of will that always takes my breath away. Lots to do tomorrow. Think I'll turn in. She gave each of us a peck on the cheek and ran lightly upstairs. I lay awake for hours, listening to the wind and the pines. Tim, Rudy, and Will had their lives back. They had careers and family and normalcy. And what did I have? I had the truth and I had my father's respect for telling it and for never backing down. Thanksgiving morning at last. The sky was blue and sun sparkled like a million diamonds on the new layer of snow which had fallen the night before. Ronnie and Kathy had already been up for hours working in the kitchen. It fell to me to get the extra leaf for the dining room table, find the warmer plate for the side dishes, and polish the wine glasses. The instant the grandfather clock struck 1, the doorbell rang. The judge stood in the doorway, carrying a pie in a fancy bakery box. Ronnie took it from him and disappeared into the kitchen. The judge looked me over, then extended a hand. "Henry? Father, how have you been?" He nodded, unsmiling. "Another year closer to retirement. You?" "Business is good," I assured him. The unspoken truth was that owning a hardware store was a far cry from the high-powered career in finance both of us had expected. Our home was cozy, but nowhere near as luxurious as his. Through the front window, I saw Kathy's parents drive up. Fred and Mary always brought good wine. I was ready for a glass, or several. The doorbell chimed again, and I opened it. After a kiss on my cheek, Mary was off to the kitchen to help. Fred slugged my arm playfully and gave me a hug. He and the judge traded handshakes and pleasantries. Kathy's brother Mike, his wife, and 2 teenage boys drove up. This time Kathy answered the door, wiping her hands on her apron and giving hugs all around. She put the 3 kids to work, putting water goblets and wine glasses on the table and lighting the candles. There was a last-minute flurry of activity as we brought all the hot dishes from the kitchen to the dining room. At last, we all sat down in our customary places. The polished wood of the table and the silverware reflected the candlelight. Everyone looked over at the judge. He bowed his head, then we followed suit, and he said the usual blessing. Lavish compliments on the meal followed, everyone exclaiming over the moistness of the turkey and at how much food there was. As we passed the steaming dishes, we talked about the weather, plans for skiing, what was new in Mike's insurance office, and how Fred and Mary were enjoying retirement. The judge put down his fork. "So, Henry, you have a big anniversary coming up." The mood was instantly shattered. His relentless gaze bored into me. "Well, son, how have you decided to deal with next spring's inevitable media circus?" It was a straightforward question. Everyone at the table waited to hear my response. I could practically hear their thoughts. Will you finally give up and admit the 4 of you made up that alien abduction story 20 years ago? Are you going to tell the reporters it was all a hoax? And the big one, can we ever live normal lives instead of being related to one of the Amagansett 4? That's what most of them were thinking, all but the judge. I could guess his thoughts, too. Will you tell the truth as you know it, or will you give in, as your friends did? I looked across the table at the judge. His gaze was still fixed on me. The silence was deafening. I cleared my throat. From the corner of my eye, I saw Ronnie move slightly in her seat next to me. I knew how important this was to her. I kept my eyes locked on the judge's. I've already been contacted by UFO Times asking for an interview. Also, America's Unsolved Mysteries. I hadn't responded to either request yet, but now I knew what I would say. I'm calling them tomorrow to decline. Kathy and I are taking Ronnie on a vacation to Hawaii immediately after the graduation ceremony. The judge's eyes burned into mine, and he dropped his gaze. After a few seconds, Kathy reminded everyone there was plenty for seconds and even thirds. We all ate more than we should, as tradition dictates, engaging in small talk. The judge was the first to leave, as always, back to the house on the golf course, back to the legal opinions he would spend his evening reading, even on Thanksgiving. The rest of us cleared the table. We adults watched football games while the kids played Guitar Hero upstairs. After coffee and liqueur and a third helping of dessert for my teenage nephews, Kathy's family left. I stepped outside the back door and looked up into the heavens. The sky was clear and filled with stars. A fingernail moon hung over the trees. As I stood there, a shooting star zoomed downward and winked out. Far off in the distance, a night bird called to its mate. The November cold seeped into my bones, making me realize how tired I was and that I should go in. Light spilled out of the kitchen. Kathy and Ronnie came out to stand beside me. Wordlessly, their arms crept around my waist. I hugged their shoulders, holding them close to me, one on each side. My darling wife and my beloved daughter. Here was truth. Here was honesty. Not in a never-ending quest to find love and approval from the twisted, lonely man who'd raised me. The three of us stood there on our little piece of earth, gazing up at the vastness of the heavens, and unseen by us at what lay beyond.
Well, that's pretty cool. So, any actual, contact with aliens, Julia, or no?
I did used to live on Cape Cod, and that's all I'll say.
Okay. Close enough. All right. So here we got Tom and Gwynne and oh, whoops, gosh, I just removed Julia for a second. There we go. Okay. So I think I've got everybody. So let's see. Well, Gwynne, I think you're the only newbie on here tonight. I think everybody else has been on here before. So how was it for you?
Oh, what a great group of authors. I'm just really happy that we all happened to be here on the same night together. It was an honor to read and with all of you, and I hope we can all do it again.
Yeah, definitely.
Indeed.
So let's see. So Sue, yeah, Tom pointed out almost all the stories but one had vomit in them.
Thank you for that, Julia. For palate cleansing us to some degree.
And let's see. And Sue, yours took the cake with, featuring the word vomitorium multiple times. So, Tom talked about his inspirations. So what are your inspirations?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, that woman walking down the street throwing up in front of me it just never left me. So I looked it up and, I realized all this time I thought Romans ate and threw up, but I guess that's a myth.
Oh.
It's funny. I mean, something you thought was true all the time. So.
Well, I'm real sorry to hear that.
The what?
If I were a Roman, I would definitely do that.
Among all the other many, many pleasures of getting to be a Roman.
Yes,
I just remember when I was in 10th grade, I went to boarding school, and these two girls on my hall, they were best friends, and one of them had the kindness to teach the other one how to be bulimic in the bathroom. She's like, "Oh, this is what you do." And I'm like, "Oh my God. Stick your finger down your throat and throw up. Then you can eat whatever you want."
Yeah.
So I was like, what are friends for?
Yeah. Well, I gather if I don't know, I knew someone who was bulimic, and she said that there was like a whole mastery to like your diet management and everything too. Like there were certain foods that would just be easier to handle. But we won't go there because that's a dark place. So
yeah, I was much more conventional. I just starved myself.
Oh, okay.
Black coffee, 100 calories.
There are 100 calories in black coffee?
No, that was my brain, when I was in my pre-anorexic state. So
okay.
Years ago. I never mastered bulimia, so
probably just as well.
Oh, I know it sounds painful, but anyway, I don't know. Quirky.
All right. Well,
but anyway, I just remember this, I'm like an elder lady, and I just remember watching The Twilight Zone, when I was 10 or something, and the people in it had no faces. That was the shock at the end, just like your story, Tom. I mean, I just remember we were like, my brother and I were like, "Can we please stay up and watch The Twilight Zone?" And my parents would be like, "Fine." And then we would get so scared. And I just remember the end where you had no idea, and all of a sudden they had these blank faces. I think something to do with uranium. I can't remember. What?
Yeah, when I wrote this, I was thinking, for sure I've seen this in multiple stories.
No, but it was still very fresh. It was fresh.
Yeah,
And
that's a
your
good one.
pronunciation, as far as I could tell, of the Italian names was good.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Not that I know, but I mean, I lived in Italy for a little while, so it seems like you did a good job.
Well,
And
that's
you
more than
must have done a lot of research too, I'll have to say.
like probably for a lot of us, way more research than was necessary for what ended up in there.
Yeah, you could see it, you could feel it. And then, you know, coming from the East Coast and living in Colorado, I mean, I only wrote personal essay for years. I've started writing fantasy. I think Colorado kind of rubbed off on me. But Julia, like when I calmed down after reading and I could focus on what you were reading, it took me a little while because I was so nervous. I was like, I believed the whole story. You know, at first, it took me a while before I realized it was fiction, right? Or wasn't it? I don't know.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, I was like,
She
wow,
said-
I want to meet this woman.
She
who
said
went through-
hesitantly, yeah, it was.
I love Cape Cod too. Did you?
I do too. I've got relatives that live there to this day.
Yeah, I used to fantasize that I could live there, but never happened. So
Cost of living it's like Boulder or any of these other really desirable places.
I know it's over
Kind
the
of have to-
top.
You have to inherit a house or something.
Right. Well, I remember I knew a guy that built a house in Wellfleet, like a long, long time ago, and he must be so rich now. I mean, I can't even imagine, you know. But so, Gwynne, where are you from?
Oh gosh, I was born and raised in LA.
Oh, and Tom's California, right?
Yes, I am. I'm in Orange County.
All right.
Although I was not born and raised here.
Born and raised, then moved to Oklahoma and from there to Colorado. So I guess I was in junior high when we got to Colorado Springs. I graduated from high school there, college in Greeley, Colorado. So now I kind of consider myself a Coloradan.
But do the Coloradans consider you a Coloradan?
Not at all. Apparently, I don't talk like they do. And I don't know. There's something about the way I look at the world that it just doesn't seem Coloradish to them, I guess, because I get that a lot. Where are you from? Well, you know.
Well, you have an interesting accent.
Yeah, I've lived in so many other places. But
I
thanks
love
for asking.
the way that you read your story, Gwynne.
Thank you.
It was your first time on this show, but I was like, this is definitely not her first time reading a dramatic story.
You know, I have a wonderful critique group that meets in one of the small towns outside Pueblo, which is where I am, and we read live every 2 weeks.
That's great.
And it really does. It's entertaining. Of course, we've been doing it on Zoom now for the past year since COVID. But it's very entertaining, but it also is a great way to critique your work.
Yeah.
You know, it's just different when it's read aloud. But I had a question for Amy. I know you're a writer. What do you write?
Let's see. At the moment, lots of emails and social media posts, but like usually when I'm, doing my writing, I'm trying to work on some women's fiction right now. So kind of realistic, humorous sort of stuff. So
Do you ever get to read on your own show?
sometimes I occasionally do. I try not to do it too much because sometimes I feel like, oh, that's probably too narcissistic to
You should read more.
You
I-
you deserve to read more if you want.
Absolutely.
I mean, you know, if you feel guilty about it, read at the end. But I think all of us would love to hear you read.
Oh, okay. Well,
So
yeah.
there you go.
Well, I can definitely do that because, yeah, I haven't done that for a while. So, and I did, make the commitment after Pikes Peak Writers Conference. I was like, okay, I need to actually do more real writing and not just the writing related stuff. So,
We want you to feel as terrified as we did.
Yeah,
Oh,
I definitely was terrified.
That's
Absolutely.
only fair.
Right.
no problem.
This whole year has been great because I actually got re-involved with my New Jersey writing groups and on Zoom. So I do a ton of stuff with them every week. It's a really robust group. And then from one of the New Jersey writers, she moved to Arizona. So now on Fridays, I'm writing with a group from Arizona, in the
Wonderful.
mornings. And this one woman's really big into self-publishing. So she's already taught me a tremendous amount, which I never really considered that before, but now I'm beginning to think about it because I figure I got to try to do something before I get too old to do anything.
Yeah, I
you know?
hear that.
Yeah, and it takes so long, even if somebody accepts you, it takes forever to get published, right? So
How true.
Yeah, it's all a very slow process, feels like.
So
I don't
we
know.
all really appreciate the opportunity to get this exposure, Amy. We really do.
yeah, you're recording this, right?
Yes, this is being recorded. It will be usually with YouTube at the end of the broadcast. It's about, like, they say to allow 24 hours, but it's usually up like within like an hour. Like I don't know what sort of magical hoodoo goes on in the background, but it's just processes the video and then boom. So I don't know.
How long does it stay on?
Indefinitely, I mean,
That's nice to know.
yeah. Yeah. And so yeah, when you read on here, like if you want, like I actually need to go back through and bookmark. I wrote down the times for the stories for this episode, so it's easier for me to put the bookmarks in for this show once it's up. But for the other ones, I think the April one, I'm forgetting what month we're on now. So the April one, I forgot to do this, but I need to go back and do it, where I even put like bookmarks on the video so that you can see where your story starts. So like if you wanted to, send your fans or friends or whoever, like even the timestamp.
In a mad fit of narcissism, just put it on endless replay. And
What else are you gonna do? You gotta do it.
Hey, you don't become a famous writer by, checking your ego out the door, right? I mean,
Right.
Hemingway would never have been Hemingway if he'd done that. Oh my God.
In any case, Amy, as always, very appreciative of you putting this together, and especially like the community of people.
anytime you need to fill in a slot, give me a call.
Absolutely.
It's wonderful to get to do it, as always.
Yeah.
And also, when is your birthday?
It's May 28th.
Oh.
Yeah. So I will be celebrating my 29th
Almost.
birthday.
Yeah.
And yeah.
No one said anything. Just keep going.
That's because we're all 29. I mean, it's like vomit. It's this marvelous coincidence.
Well, I bathe in the blood of virgins every night, and then
Hey, it works for me.
yeah, that's just, you do what you got to do.
Long climb up that mountain to get to that bathing location.
Better than a penny hot springs. Way better.
Right?
Just a little
Right.
smelly, that's all. Well, I guess, probably good time to wrap up. And yeah, next month it's going to be interesting. I mean, I don't know. I think we're already kind of getting ready for it. The theme next month is dead
Yeah,
things.
what's the date and theme for next month?
Yeah, so it's dead things, and it is, I just had the date in front of me. I want to say it's like, I don't think it's June 19th. That would be too easy. It's June 16th. So June
Oh,
16th
that's good. Yeah.
at 7 p.m. And we have Carter Wilson is going to be reading. And I don't know, it's pretty good that we got him. I mean, basically, I just, begged and pleaded and said, I know his daughter's going to college and I know where she's going. So, since I've clearly been stalking him, he just has to do what I want him to do. So, yeah, just a little arm twisting. So he has a new book out. I think it's called The Dead Husband.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, but yeah, that's going to be a fun show. Anything that we have, that has a dark theme, everybody seems to get very excited. So, yeah. And I'm hoping to soon put together a little reel of all of our cat video bombs from the show because
Yes. I'm sure you saw mine a few minutes ago. He's on my lap now, but yeah, the tail was in the frame and all that.
My dog slept through the whole thing.
oh, nice. So, yeah, try to keep it fun, try to keep it fresh, But anyway, thank you all so much for being on here. And I'm glad that we were able to get through this without any major technical difficulties. So, yeah, we'll call it a wrap.
All right. Nice meeting all of you.
Yeah, nice to be with everybody. It was a pleasure.
Certainly.
Hi, all.
Good
All right.
night.
Good night.
All righty.